Just a note about today's topic. We had some technical issues with recording the Laserburn episode. Instead, we bring you today's segment, Battledroids. Thanks for listening.
Hello everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show all about tabletop gaming where we give rulebooks the book club treatment, which is to say that we review them based on how they read and the rules. So grab a glass of whatever and join us as we dive deep into the bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and tiny fine print of games you know or maybe have never heard of. I am your host, Max, and joining me today with a brand new microphone and sounding amazing, Troy.
Hello.
And working behind the scenes, of course, is our producer, Jay. Today's topic is Battletech First Edition, sometimes known, at least on the cover, as Battledroids. And we will get into why that's not called that anymore. So, Troy, this is a game that you are fond of?
Yeah, absolutely.
I also have a history with the license, at least the property.
Yeah, I started with the cartoon, not knowing what I was getting into, and now I'm a citizen of the Inner Sphere, big fan of the way the setting tackles sci-fi, and then that specific military sci-fi theme. I think it's great. There's so much to grab onto. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of books if you're a fiction head. So there's a lot to dive in on this setting, and the game itself is a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, my own experience with it. Obviously I've been using computers, but they were like the home computer and they ran on DOS up until that point. And I had a few games that I'd play, but my first computer that had Windows 95 on it came with a copy of MechWarrior 2.
Excellent.
And that was the beginning of the end.
Yeah, that was the start of something greater, that's for sure.
For sure. And then I realized that it was part of this whole other bigger thing called Battletech, and that was a trip. So, for the history and origins of the game, is created by FASA Games in 1984. Created by Jordan Wiseman and L. Ross Babcock III. What a name.
No, that's a more interesting name than any of the names in Battledroids itself.
Probably. Yeah, we'll get into some of the naming convention jokes about Battletech later. So originally it's named Battledroids, and I'm not sure exactly why they picked the droids term, but even though it was a small game company for the most part, they may have released some things, I think, before this. It drew the ire of one George Lucas. Probably not personally, but Lucasfilm, I assume. And they were immediately given a cease and desist within the first year of publishing. People still bought the game, and it's actually a pretty great collector's item if you have it. If you have the original Battledroids box.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there was some tension there, and within the next year, on the second edition of the game, it is called Battletech. And there's some errata that's included, and they've changed and simplified some things. In preparation for this episode, I was also skimming through that one just to kind of see what they did, and a lot of it's streamlining. I can't say the games are that different, and Troy, you've even made mention that, and you play the current Catalyst game version.
That's right. And with Battletech, not a lot has changed over all the years. So you mostly see a streamlining or an improvement of the layout of information, especially in the record sheets. But the game is the game in many regards, and Battledroids sets that up. And what you see in Battledroids in terms of even the hex-based diagrams for line of sight, I mean, that's almost exactly what you're seeing in later editions of this rulebook.
Yep. The actual layout and look of the droid, well, the mech sheets, in this case, droid sheets, they get refined, but the content on them is about the same.
Yeah, it's the same information, just presented in a better way, I think.
Yeah. Certainly the hit point tracker on the sheet looks decidedly less bizarre.
Yeah, that's right.
In later editions. FOSSA goes through a whole bunch of lawsuit stuff with many, many different people coming into play. Some of them with legitimate grievances, some of them much less so.
Right.
We'll leave all of that for another episode. But as far as the game, the way that it was reviewed at the time was it was reviewed in both White Dwarf and the Space Gamer. And giving it I guess on both accounts, from what I could tell, a solid 7 out of 10.
Yeah, it had a favorable tone. The same thing that everyone criticizes Battledroids and later Battletech for is the list of modifiers.
Yeah.
And that appears in these, but I mean, once you're through that looking glass with those modifiers and you kind of grok them and you understand what they mean, you're off to the races. You understand the game.
Yeah, it's like any technical war game where it requires a kind of leap of faith or a learning process to, as you say, grok the rules and then move on to actually enjoying and playing the game. And to some people that could be a barrier to entry, but most people like it once they get past that.
Yeah.
I remember the review I think it's in the Space Gamer review, said something along the lines of, don't throw it, it's a good game, but I'm not going to be throwing out any of my other war games.
Right, exactly. Oh, and that's what's so interesting about this game is it's at a time where there really isn't this same conception of sci-fi war games being an entirely different genre or vehicle of play. In this, there's kind of war games. And this game, just to get into more the system of Battledroids, it is effectively an armored combat game. It's a tank game with way more agile tanks, but it's not so different than a World War II tank simulating game.
Yeah, I mean, the fantastical sci-fi element allows for more agility, as you say, greater armament,
better defense,
more speculative specificity about what happens when things get blown up.
Yep.
So for those that don't know what it's about, if you haven't been able to pick up on that already, it is a game about big stompy robots.
Yeah, exactly.
Heavily inspired by those in anime, which would have been kind of vaguely trickling in at the time. And those close relations and associations will come and haunt them later. But in the meantime, yeah, the only major difference between the inspiration of things like Macross, an anime, for those that don't know, is these mechs are not that fast. They are faster than, I guess, some armored vehicles by comparison.
Right. But
they are more of the sort of ominous, slow stomping battle machines that cover the field. I guess more like a modern tank, less like a flying death machine.
They're like an MBT on legs, because they've got main guns. They've got a lot of hardware that you would associate with a fighter jet or a main battle tank, but it still has a certain industrial lumbering quality that sets it apart from the more acrobatic anime mechs, I guess.
I'd say that's accurate. Oh, and before we get too far into this, I have to we need to give a little shout out to the contents of this box set.
Oh, good point.
And the quality of the printing, which I was actually pretty impressed with a game that's as old as this is, and especially a first edition.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a rule book, battle mat sheets. So these are hex grids, and this game is obviously taking some of the assumptive points of hex-based tile games like Avalon Hill and SPI games. But then it also comes with little constructible plastic robot sprues of models.
You get 2 plastic battle droids and your 2 map sheets, and then you get cardboard stands to represent other battle droids that you may use in the game. And the way they even talk about it is you can proxy and sub in different things, and they have a very open attitude to how you might use the components.
Yeah, and it makes for a really nice teaser because you do get 2 proper made mechs, droids in this case, but you have enough pieces to play the whole game.
That's right.
And then there's a few other hex tile sort of layover. So if something happens, you can put those down. I think there's also some building tiles.
And then there is some more conventional forces too, like jeeps and infantry.
As for the layout of the book, it's double columned. It has nice, clear black bar headers with white text and a pretty easy to read font. Honestly, it was a lot easier than reading another thing that we will be covering later, Laserburn, which seemed to be typed on a typewriter. So this has got a professional layout and printing, and it's got actually a reasonable number of visuals. Most first edition books, certainly ones that we look at, are very art light. This is too, but it has a lot of diagrams that help make sense of the game.
That I found to be sort of the precursor to the later books and, the classic Battletech interpretations of Total Warfare that we have today that, use very similar diagrams to what you're seeing in this. And this is the start of it all. So it's really cool that Battledroids had the clarity in the first edition because, like we said, this game doesn't change a lot as time goes on. It's 40 years old now, and people who played Battledroids could come in and play classic Battletech today and just be right into the mix.
Yeah, you wouldn't really feel that much difference. Again, the way that certain parts of the turn sequence are handled would maybe be a bit different, but it's all in there.
And the way this game works is effectively, it's a hex-based war game, right? We've alluded to that, but you're using your 6-sided hexes to modify and control your movement. The game is broken down into 3 effective brother-sister rule sets with basic Battledroids introductory rules, which gives you the very standard movement in combat. It's followed by Advanced Battledroids, which introduces the record sheet and much more detailed combat interactions, as well as heat scale. And finally, Expert Battledroids, which includes the more personalized rules for what are referred to as droid warriors, as well as crits and critical hits, which really give this game a lot of its flavor.
Yeah, especially that customization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way this game resolves basically every skill, every check is 2d6 added together.
How that works off of the actual stats and the rules is sometimes a contentious point with people who've played other games.
Right. Do you mind explaining that a little bit?
So this game is, I'll try to cobble together a term for this, which I think most wargamers will probably understand, and maybe even some role players. It is a stat low, roll high system.
Yes.
So good stats are low numbers, and what you're then trying to do is roll over those stats. The idea being that the lower that threshold is, the easier it is to pass. And this is contrary to other probably more common systems where the stat is high and you're trying to roll within that on the lower side of that. Right? So a percentile system would be a great example of that.
Exactly, yeah.
Where you have your target number, which may be like 50, you roll a D100, and you're trying to go 50 or less. Now, I can see some sense that the sense that this makes is entirely feel. Mathematically, it doesn't really matter what side of the numbers you're landing on, provided that they have a maximum cap. But that would be determined by the maximum number you could roll on the die, which is 12 in this case. So it really just comes down to feeling. What feels better? Having high numbers on the sheet being a good thing, or having high rolls be a good thing?
And it's interesting that an RPG, as we were sort of saying earlier before recording, an RPG kind of sits on one side of that, while you could argue a war game sits on the other side in terms of where that high number is most, I guess, appealing.
Yeah. So the argument that I made was that in a role-playing game, because there's advancement within a single character over the course of playing an adventure, presuming you're not playing a one-shot where you're not going to change your stats, it feels better to look down at your sheet and seeing numerical improvement. In a war game, which is more often just a one-off, that's probably less important. And you could see some people wanting to prioritize or emphasize the feeling of a high roll. That begins to not work when you start playing campaign, because there are abilities to improve certain aspects of your characters in some games where campaigns happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, it really depends on how many individual statistics can be increased. Like in a game where you're just like a World War II game where you're playing campaign, you might be getting reinforcements. That just means you have more options for placement in the next game.
Right.
In a game where there's stats and pilots, in the case of Battletech, that begins to feel weird because now I'm trying to work my way down to a 1. Now, there's lots of ways to fix this or make it feel more intuitive. Like you could say it's a class-based thing. So first class, your best, right?
Yeah, 100%. It could be like a grading as opposed to a numerical statistical score.
Right. But that's all just mental framing, right?
Yes.
And as we say, mathematically, zero difference based on the methodology for determining success. As long as you're choosing one area as being success and then the other area past that number being failure and the roll to determine it, I mean, it doesn't matter. As far as I know, Battletech is one of those standard examples that does this, because I even know that in the few cases of like Avalon Hill games that use multiple one-sided dice, or six-sided dice, it's usually roll low. I can't think of an example where it isn't, but there could be. But the convention is bigger number on the tile, better number.
Well, and Battletech, or Battledroids, I should say, will kind of subvert your expectation in more than one way. Just to move on from how that works in regards to the dice roll, the first way you apply a dice roll is in the turn sequence in the first step at the initiative phase, where both players will roll 2d6 and compare. And this again will catch you off guard if you're not a Battletech player. Whoever wins initiative goes second. So you don't win first, you win second, and just by a point we'll explain in a mere moment here, you are given the opportunity to see what your opposition is going to do and then react to it. And that's why the initiative pays you to go second, as opposed to putting you first, giving you the opportunity for an alpha strike or a first hit. In this, it's going to give you a reactive capability you otherwise wouldn't have.
That does make some tactical sense. And there are initiative systems, I can think of at least a couple Western gunfight style games that kind of function like this.
Right.
Yeah, it is unusual on the whole, where the idea is you don't want to get the advancement, you want to see what your opponent does. But because the movement and combat phases are separated, that does actually work tactically to your advantage. So maybe you can explain like how movement and combat work.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the movement phase, you're going to move your droid hex to hex, spending your movement points, your MP, as you walk, run, and jump around. This will be on your map sheet. You control one droid at a time and you'll resolve its movement. Then your opponent will switch over and resolve their movement. If, of course, they're the initiative player. The initiative player always goes second. So I'll move a droid, they'll move a droid, etc. When you get to the combat phase, one player, the non-initiative player, the inactive player, will declare and conduct all of their attacks. Then the initiative player will declare and conduct all of their attacks.
Yeah.
How this works in practice is that all combat is considered simultaneous and damage does not apply until all attacks are resolved. So there isn't an applied damage step in the rules, but it says at the end of the combat phase in sort of a subsection, you would then apply all damage, make sure the criticals are factored, make sure the droids that blow up, and that would be how you would resolve that. But again, your shooting is going to be second because you're the initiative player. So it has a really interesting way of giving you this ability to read and anticipate, and that's what initiative is, as opposed to merely being first off the gun.
It does take some getting used to if you've played other things that maybe play a bit more, I don't want to call it standard because it's not really a thing when you're dealing with rules. It's whatever you're used to, but what is more typical, I guess.
Yeah, and I find that I have to remind myself. I'll be playing, or maybe I'll even do a solo game one day, and I'll have to remind myself, like, wait a second, no, initiative is second. Remind yourself. But it leads to these really cool moments where one droid thinks it can outmaneuver you, but you still have a guy in the pocket that can outmaneuver that droid on its go. So it creates these rippling, probabilities and wrinkles in what you're trying to determine as the outcome of this turn sequence.
Right. Yeah. I guess this brings us on to the fact that because it's a man-to-man or droid-to-droid fighting game, there's some consideration for facing in this as well.
Yep.
And hex facing, no less.
The details of your hex facing and your hex-oriented movement is fully explained. In basic, it's just what you're looking at. But in advanced, you can rotate at the torso. So it does give you a little bit of a different line of sight, for example. But you move and change facing by expending your movement points. Like we said, you can walk, run, and jump. And these different things will allow you to traverse the terrain on your map sheet, which includes elevation, light woods, heavy woods, bodies of water, and as Max said earlier, it can even have structures and things like that too. So you're using your movement points to navigate that environment and then set up the shot that you're going to take in the coming combat phase. And combat's handled following movement. Like we said, all damage is simultaneous after all droids have acted. And in basic battle droids, you will have an abstracted damage value, I guess is the best way to put it. And you'll roll on an armor penetration chart for successful attacks. That is the way that you would resolve a droid striking a droid in basic without using the record sheet a lot of later Battletech players would be familiar with. And that's a direct allusion to a World War II tank game.
Yes. There's a lot of classic war game conceits in this version especially. It's very much appealing to people who already play hex and tile games.
Yes. It's kind of the fantasy version of a hex and tile war game. You know what I mean? It's the extra, the sci-fi take on that concept. So if you were someone who was playing Panzer Leader, this might be the next step for you to get into something a little bit more unbuttoned, as it were.
And it's not as though there aren't sci-fi games that exist that are also like this, but this one's got giant mechs in it. And it comes with actual buildable giant mechs, which would become kind of the unique selling point. It's one of those things. I'd actually make a point about this one. Modeled miniatures for wargaming definitely have existed throughout history in various forms. But in the American wargaming scene, they're very much a subculture.
Especially compared to Britain, yeah.
Within a subculture, which is wargaming. And it has to do with the accessibility and people wanting to play the game and not have to have ready-made models. Also, model production is not the most common thing. Obviously, toy manufacturers, there's a lot of the people who are making models in the 70s and then even going into the early 80s are either doing it all themselves or trying to find model kits and then kind of butchering and adjusting those pieces. And then there are a few brands that specifically, but again, hard to come by.
Yeah, especially over the pond, because it was like Airfix would be like your main like plastic soldier company at the time. You know what I mean? So they weren't as common.
Yeah. And so having something so specific as a bipedal robot with a very specific look. And one of the nice things that is established fairly early on in Battletech's history, even in Battledroids in this particular edition, is the unique designs of each mech.
Mm-hmm.
They're reasonably good at creating silhouettes that really sell the look of those things as being unique. Like people even have like their favorites, right? Like on the cover of this one, I think is a Warhammer. It's like on the cover of the box, which is kind of the classic old school design, but you know, they feature a whole bunch even in this edition.
And there's some of the really classic droids and later mechs will be in here, including Phoenix Hawk, Archer, Wasp. Like there's some really cool ones that make it in that I really like, that are just, you know, your typical IS mechs. But it's great to see such an early appearance by them and see some of their some of the ideas behind them implemented so, you know, early in the Battledroids Battletech canon.
Yeah, and I mean, some of those designs in the earlier editions are, shall we say, a little wonky looking.
Yeah, they get better as time goes on. And if you look at the modern MechWarrior Online / Catalyst Game Labs designs, they're definitely reminiscent of the early designs, but with a more modern take on it. But there's a charm to some of those early mechs. And I think those initial designs, if they weren't as strong as they were, this game wouldn't have the same 40-year pedigree that it has now.
I agree. And even with the the peculiar look of some of them at this stage, they still have that distinctive look even between each other, which is the thing that really was important.
I agree.
One tank looks like another tank and all that. But in this game, it's almost like the tanks are these sort of action heroes.
Well, that's a point that I want to make really quick. This is a big battle game because you're driving big robots and they operate like tanks and you're fighting over, like kilometers of space.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a skirmish game. You're just one guy. You're just maybe a handful of robots on your side or a handful of droids versus a handful of droids.
Yeah.
So it manages to stride this relationship between being a depiction of a big clash, a confrontation that's going to hit the history books. But it also is a personal struggle. And I just think the combination of those two things, in addition to the mechs being personable in their characteristics and in their design, it adds this sense of humanity to the fight that a lot of big battle games just lose completely.
Yeah, I think that's the secret sauce in Battletech, generally, as compared to some other sci-fi war game. And especially coming off of the Hex and Tile games, which I personally love, but I can see being very generic and kind of opaque with some of their detailing.
Yes.
And not having a lot of character, because that's not a priority. There's obviously exceptions to this. I know SPI put out a lot of games that have a bit more zhuzh to them.
Right.
But having it be like, that's my hunchback mech, and that's its pilot, and that pilot is a person who's good at these things, really adds a lot. Like, I can't think of a tank game that does that. Can you? There might be one.
Not a contemporary tank game of this era. There are later games I can think of, like What a Tanker and stuff, that add crew experience and fun little things like that.
Sure.
But from this era, it's really quite unique in that it puts a lot of personality into your pilot or your droid warrior. And it's really interesting. And I mean, like, in the base game, you're effectively dealing with elimination rules. So there's not a lot of complexity in terms of like what you're trying to do other than waste the other mech, or droid. But the way the texture of that goes is so interesting. And even though it's just two droids, the movement and the weapon selection and the detail that comes into advanced battle droids makes it really satisfying, even though it's just a few guys.
So I think we can now get into what, at least when this game was reviewed, what I suppose is the ugly elephant in the room, which are the very meticulous modifier tables.
Yeah, there is a few things to keep in mind when you're tracking your modifiers. It's a detailed list. It's going to include your range, the movement, both that you undertook and your enemy undertook, your target, and the terrain that you're shooting through, across, and over. So there is a little bit of a +2, -1, +1, -1 that goes on for every type of shot you take to find out your final modifier. And then this is also going to be done hand in hand with the elevation rules and your line of sight as part of your combat sequence, right? Where first you got your droid, select your target, you confirm your line of sight and your range, you determine what your range modifier is, you then determine the target movement modifier for how they moved and what that means to you, and then you would determine any terrain modification, if they have any cover, for example, if they're in woods or anything like that. So you go through all that, then you roll your 2d6. It's not that bad, but it feels like a lot to have to do on every dice roll, especially compared to some of the simpler war games or role-playing games, which is just roll a die, beat a target number, and walk away. You don't have to come up with these this detailed resolution of, okay, it is this hard to hit this guy.
Yeah, it's interesting to actually play that. I know from playing the modern variant Alpha Strike, which is an interesting point because like the simpler rules of this edition very much hearken to what the spin-off rules Alpha Strike are like now.
That's really true.
And then the core or more advanced game is a bit more of the traditional, I guess what you'd call classic Battletech.
That's right.
Yeah, the modifiers, I mean, my own experience is they seem daunting and then you do get used to them. So I don't know that it's enough not to recommend the game. Certainly newer editions streamline or simplify some of those so that it's a bit easier to kind of procedurally check off the things in your head. Whereas in this game, I think there's an attempt to make it easy to read, but the difficulty in any designer trying to lay out things for a layman is that they are as far from that as possible when it's their game.
Right. That's so true.
And that's true of pretty much anything that anyone makes. This is why some software, when it's not run through a UX kind of point of view, like a user experience or user design mindset, is often very esoteric.
Dwarf Fortress and Aurora come to mind both.
Sure, yeah. A very original Dwarf Fortress. Not the easiest thing to learn, even with like a full wiki. It's like, oh my.
Agreed.
That being an example, I will actually say that because they understand the cognitive limitations of dealing with a board game, even back in the pre-computer days, or at least before that's an established form of entertainment, that there are limits to what people are willing to do in order to play. I will say, just as a point, and having researched a lot of games from like the 60s and 70s, people used to have a much bigger tolerance for that.
It's really true, yeah. You could make 100 reasons for why that might be the case, but there definitely is a skew towards detail and chrome in these earlier rule sets.
Yeah, and I would actually say in comparison to some of those, like I'm giving maybe an example of like Advanced Squad Leader being another one. That's got a lot of that detail that you really have to work your way up to learning. By comparison to, say, that, Battletech's pretty light.
I agree with that for sure, yeah. Battletech or Battledroids is still not as detailed as a contemporary historical game may be, because it is meaning to be a fantasy play space, you know?
Yeah.
It does have a very detailed setting, which we'll get into, and now that we're talking about advanced Battledroids, you can see the level of thought that goes into even this imaginary time and place, because the record sheets for the droids really give you a detailed perspective on what these machines are supposed to be like. You get the armor, the internal structure, the heat scale, and the critical hit charts for your droids on a generic, regrettably ugly form that you color in and kind of fill in what you don't need to leave behind these boxes that represent your armor and your internal structure. And as you play, you check these off as you're struck by the different weapons. So you're dealing with a much more comprehensive play experience in advanced.
Yeah.
And I kind of think this is where most people's experience of Battletech comes from, thinking of the character sheet that you have for your mech. And the advanced mode expands the combat phase with both weapons, physical attacks, and a heat phase. And your movement and your attacks both will go into your heat.
Yes.
And then you'll resolve that in a specific phase, phase 9 of the turn. And what that does is it results in your droid either venting their heat and maintaining their function, having enough heat that you have to mitigate it and take limited actions in your following turn. Or if you haven't played safe, you have so much heat that you're at risk of shutdown, and your droid can just actually power down on you.
Yeah. So the addition of heat is, I guess, one of those really interesting, unique elements of this series.
People who know the computer games, you know, they really know the heat management aspect of this.
Yes. It's prevalent through pretty much all versions of it. There's a few where I can think where it's not like that. Like, I don't know if you remember that Mech Warrior Super Nintendo game. I don't think that had heat in it.
Oh, okay. Was that also on Genesis and you played a Timberwolf and you moved around in isometric?
Yeah. Or was it, Jacob, was there a Super Nintendo version of that?
I think there were two versions. I think there was a first-person one and there was an isometric one as well.
There was a first-person one?
Yeah, I think it's just called, maybe just Mech Warrior. I'm not sure. You have to look. And then there's Mech Warrior 3050, I think. That's the Timberwolf one.
Right.
Okay. That's the one I remember for the Genesis.
Jay is the resident video game knowledge database.
I mean, I just remember playing Mech Warrior 2, and then more recently I've been playing Mech Warrior Online.
Yeah.
With a couple of friends, so that's kind of how I know the game.
Yeah, and you're familiar with some of the other like adaptations through various different consoles and things.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
there's also the modern Battletech game for
Oh,
get
yeah.
on Steam.
That one's great. That one is probably as close to playing Battletech on your computer as you could probably get.
That'd be a great intro for anyone who wants to get into that hobby. Is probably play that game. You get the feel for what Battletech's all about.
Yeah. I'm worried it might spoil some people, but whatever. I mean, if you enjoy playing tabletop games, it's not going to be a deterrent.
That's right. And in this game, the droid warriors are going to get detailed, but in advanced mode, droid warriors and pilots are just given a flat gunnery skill level of 4. And this is the introduction to 4 being your normal, your base stat. Because we talked about how your stats go down, 1 being the primo pilot. So 4 would represent your average, still trained, still very competent, but coming in at the middle of the road.
Mm-hmm.
So when you start with your skill level, it's 4. You'll then add on all those modifiers we discussed a little bit earlier. And that's going to be how you determine what your target number is for your 2d6 roll. After you've made your to hit roll, now you have a location chart. And this is going to determine the hit location. And that is, again, going to plug right into that record sheet where you have your illustration of your mech, your droid, with arms, legs, torso, head. Once damage has been calculated, it's assigned based on the individual weapons used. So we talked about in basic, there's an abstract damage value. That's gone. Now we actually know what is the weaponry you're using and what is the damage output from that weapon. And when you strike a region, you would fill in the damage boxes on that limb. And if there's any spillover, it goes back to the next most relevant other limb. So for example, if you get hit in the left arm and it destroys the left arm, the remaining damage points would then carry through to the torso.
Yeah, no, I like the way that it brings in these elements. There's a kind of training regimen with the different levels of rules, because you can see how now bringing in individual limbs and individual weapon components is going to set you up for doing your own version of that.
There's sort of 4 levels to this game. Even though it stops at expert Battledroids, there's a secret 4th highest tier of gameplay in Battledroids.
S tier.
It's S tier Battledroids. And that is making your own Battledroid, starting from a list of components, including engines, and you're setting your tonnage, and you're really going in to define a mech. And this is the start of that in advance, where you're seeing what those components can do. And also, each of these components are going to plug back into the heat tracking, which we talked about. You're tracking your heat based on the actions taken, the weapons fired, and you're comparing that to the heat sinks of your droid. So you're going to see if you've gone over, if you're within tolerance, and then there's the, as we mentioned, risk of shutdown. And if you have a risk of shutdown, you're a sitting duck. You can just get smoked by the opposing droid. And it's something you really have to be careful about.
In the sense of most of these types of war games, it's about positioning yourself in the right place, in the right time, and covering all of your angles and just waiting and seeing what your opponent does and then reacting to that. But you're right. If you get caught out in the open, which makes perfect sense, and you get some really direct hits, you're done. You can take quite a few. I will make a point that you can get cooked without losing it, but I've seen games go really fast depending on how many hits a single mech could take from usually multiple shooters.
Me and Jay were playing, and not classic, but we were playing Battletech, and someone came around the corner and just got a pilot kill and just headshotted a mech. And it was just like, well, there we go.
Yeah, that's an open possibility that your pilot could get wiped.
Yeah, it totally is. And that's what Expert Battledroids Step 3 introduces into this equation, is it introduces the droid warrior, or the later termed mech warrior, who will pilot the droids.
Mm-hmm.
They are given a few different stats, 2 stats, a pilot skill and a gunnery skill. So that 4 we talked about, that stat number, that is the base gunnery skill now of a droid warrior, which can go as low as 1 and can go above 4, can go as 5 to 7, depends how terrible a pilot you want. And pilot skill, that's a different stat, and that's used for certain maneuvers. So if you want your mech to lie down, to go prone to avoid incoming fire, you can pass a pilot skill. And that's again a 2d6 with some modifiers, because it's Battledroids, of course it has modifiers. And that would be how you would effectively do more complicated maneuvers. And in Expert, they also start to add in some more, well, there's the optional rules that kind of come after Expert, but are meant to integrate into Expert. And they add a few more bits of interest, like additional unit types, such as tanks, jeeps, infantry. So you get your unit counters very much like a hex-based war game for your conventional unit choices.
Mm-hmm.
And you are also given the stats for 10 battle droids.
Which is it's good. It gives you a lot of variety, and you can play around with the different combinations.
Do you have a favorite out of the 10 that are in this book? I think I'm an archer guy.
I like the archer for what will probably be later referred to in more recent editions as a missile boat.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Can certainly annoy some people.
The archer is awesome for just long bombs, so I really enjoy it. And when you look at the art for it, it's one that kind of maintained the original styling in a really cool way. Like the modern look in Battletech doesn't completely leave behind the look in Battledroids, kind of like the Warhammer does. Like the modern Warhammer still has gun arms, and that's how you can tell it's the Warhammer is still the Warhammer.
Yep.
But the modern one looks quite different to the old one we see on the cover of this game. But the Archer still has some of that classic flair, so I really like that.
Yeah, still got that sort of hatch release style missile pod system.
Yeah. And then you can just picture all the Macross missiles flying out of them. So it's just really cool. Oh, I did forget to mention critical hits and their effects are detailed. And it also includes a way a droid warrior, so a pilot, can be injured or killed. They call it damaged. So that's just weird terminology. You can damage a droid warrior. But regardless, it is how you would be able to, get that headshot and get a pilot kill and end a fight quick. So, for example,
damaged a pilot sounds like clan talk.
It does sound like clan talk.
For those that know what we're talking about, hopefully you get that.
Yeah, when we get far enough to talk about the clans in a future episode, we'll for sure give you the lore dump on those guys. But the last thing to mention here, the last two things to mention, I should say, are optional rules for spontaneous fires and even using discarded limbs as clubs. So it's a relatively small rule book, but it still has enough space to talk about grabbing an arm that's been blown off and using it as a weapon.
Yeah. Oh, and just to answer your question, I'm probably going to go with the rifleman.
Oh, rifleman's cool. Yeah, good call.
I hadn't made up my mind on that, and I had slightly forgotten what the layout was, but I could have probably just guessed that they had the classics, which you had already mentioned a few. But I was like, wait, which one do I like? And it's like, yeah, I like the rifleman.
Rifleman, another gun arm mech. If you have a lance that's a Warhammer, a rifleman, and 2 blackjacks, gun arms for days.
It looks like an aircraft gun with legs.
It does, exactly. It's like a Bofors.
Yeah, exactly.
And the last thing here is there is a design rules for making your own battle droid with wide-ranging parts and customization. This is something that some Battletech players are obsessed with in the modern era, where they will buy the unit construction books and just make the most detailed, customized vehicles. While other people believe that's not the point. The point is these bespoke mechs that have been created for us, we should be using them, so let's play these battles. So there's a little bit of a difference of opinion between some members of the community as to designing your own mechs, but at the end of the day, more options is better, and being able to create a battle droid it's sort of an investment, but it's a satisfying thing. And once you've made your own battle droid, you've experimented with it, you start making customizations, and in later editions, there's salvage that you can start to incorporate when you're doing custom builds. So it really opens some doors. But in this, it's just cool to see that they are that forward thinking with the design.
Yeah, you can really make it your own. And that, again, takes that idea of the hero focused armor game.
Yeah.
And then builds on it. And as far as I've seen at the table, the most, I don't want to call it contentious, because most people are fairly accepting if they've already allowed in the game that there are custom builds.
Yes.
Not so much the model, but there are sometimes some math checking that goes on that can delay if it wasn't done preemptively before the game was started and brought together, because people will come and it's like, oh, this is like my legitimate Warhammer variant. And all right, well, now everybody's got to look at it and see that it actually, the tonnage lines up, and there's no weirdness going on. And you know, people are fairly trusting of this, and certainly older gamers, they don't care quite as much. But I've definitely seen some heated debates around whether this particular build is legitimate or it needs to be respect.
Yes, that is kind of the contentious part of any design rules. And like, there's a lot of indie war games that give you full unit design rules just integrated into the game because they're model agnostic. But in a game like this that has its own model range, it's still pretty cool that you can make your own totally custom mechs. And yeah, I think the thing that it's best for is, instead of making a mech from the ground up or a droid from scratch, it's to take an existing droid and make your own variant of it. And I think that's the most interesting thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that I've always been, I don't know if I say impressed, but I always take note of the fact that in many of the rule books, and I think even in this one, they specifically say that like anything can represent a mech or a droid.
Yeah, they do specifically call that out.
Yeah, like you can use paper cutouts, which they provide. You can use fully built models. You could probably play it as a hex and tile game if you wanted.
You fully could.
Especially, actually, one corresponding element to that is that all mech variants and their models have a serial number, or like effectively a model number, which you could put on the tile.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah, you could.
And then you might classify that with like the other corner of the tile being like 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, just to denote if you have multiple. But yeah, you could play it that way. I think it's more interesting to play with the models. That's weird because I don't care. Like, I like tiles, but for something, this game feels like it was made for like cool mech models.
It really was, and is. I mean, that's what got me into Battletech, was the robots. You know, it wasn't that it was a creative take on a hex strategy game. No, it was a robot game, and that's cool. So that got me into it when I was young, because the cartoon introduced the idea of these cool robots who were giant and they had laser fights. So I was in. And then learning there were models of them, like, what? That's awesome. Because there used to be a range of Mech Warrior toys based on the show, or Battletech toys, I mean to say.
Yep.
And it's like, this is the quote grown-up quote version of it, if you can say something like that.
Yeah, you know, it's like having a toy model airplane as a kid and then getting into like, I don't know, some kind of jet fighting strategy game where you have tiny, serious jet plane models.
Exactly. These were my adult toys.
Yeah, exactly. I have rules for using them, therefore they are adult.
Yeah, you got it.
And now it's lore time. Battletech lore. And the first appearance of any of that, which is, it's sparsely scattered throughout the book. There are some areas where it's a bit more like focused down, but you really don't get a lot of the detail that you would see in later editions. And certainly it's spin-off things like novels and all this other stuff.
And this is where the human sphere, later coined the inner sphere, as we've all come to know it, comes into play. And they talk about this as the Dark Age. There are the succession wars. So there's a series of these conflicts that play out after there is a political body called the Star League. It's effectively the total human government that's expanding outward from Terra or Earth. And throughout the era of the Star League, there is prosperity. It seems like it's peaceful, but there is a lot of contention in the border territories. But there is a civil war that plays out that destroys this Star League and disintegrates it. And then a period of succession wars follow this as the human houses, so these would be the nation states of the era, all compete and jockey against each other, you know, with these incredibly destructive weapons over who's going to now take over the ruins of the Star League. And that is the backdrop to your Battletech experience or your Battledroids experience. So this is after the devastating Civil War, the Amaris Civil War as it's later termed. it leaves the Terran hegemony in ruins, and the different house lords all seize different worlds from the pocket around Terra, and that's what's referred to as the Terran hegemony. So these are all gathered up through acts of violence by the successor states, I mean, and the leader of the military, General Kerensky of the Star League Defense Force, sees what's happening, and he's like, no, this is ridiculous. I'm not picking a side in this. So he takes about 70 to 80% of the Star League Defense Force and goes on a self-imposed exodus to leave the inner sphere or the human sphere behind. That then opens the gates to a series of succession wars between the houses who have nothing in between them. And these are of extreme brutality. Widespread use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons in the first and second succession wars that just lead to devastation like the human species has never seen before. And then what happens is there's a change. There's still war. A third succession war begins. But because of the just absolute untold devastation, there's a change in the temperament of the belligerents. And what they do is they kind of impose this code of chivalric honor around the use of battle droids. There's certainly, still lots of murder and bad stuff and betrayal and all that. But the idea is we're not going to use these weapons of mass destruction, and we're not going to destroy the scant few remaining technological resources we have that our whole society is reliant on. And it's through this third succession war that the idea of lances of mechs fighting, salvaging, this whole concept of what a Battletech fight looks like sort of takes its shape here.
It's an interesting concept to think about because, there's like a cultural revolution in a sense that then makes nuclear weapons abhorrent by way of their own use and elevates the use of these battle mechs or droids.
Yes, that's a really good way to describe it.
Just for a broader context, it's interesting. I guess there's some thought to the scale of these things. So this is, I guess, what you could call semi-galactic. The inner sphere is not, in the proportions of the entire Milky Way galaxy, not very big.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
But when you look at a map of it, it's got a lot of star systems in it.
It's some 2,000 inhabitable worlds, I understand.
In the lore that is present in the book, there's a few references to things that will be more established, like some of the nations, like House Davion of the Federated Suns, but really not that much else. For the reference of anyone who doesn't know, there are 5 major nations. So they'd be the Free Worlds League, the Federated Suns, the Draconis Combine, the Lyran Commonwealth, and the Compelling Confederation. And each of them has their own sort of historical precedent for what they're drawing their inspiration from. But in a lot of cases, especially as lore gets written about them, they actually do feel more unique and less like Space Japan or Space Germany.
Right, exactly.
For some examples. And that's a pretty big staple to the lore as we kind of feel it like now. And people like buy their favorite house's patch and like sew it on their jacket when they go to the Battletech tournament. But at this point, there really isn't any of that. There's a suggestion of it, and there's certainly this history, and it's more like a preface than it is like a narrative.
Yes, it's something that will be expanded upon later under the title Battletech in great detail with faction sourcebooks, which go into like the cultural organization of these successor states. But at this stage, they're just there to give you a backdrop to get these droids on the table.
There are some themes, though, that are initially set up. The theme of a golden age now being run backwards into the ground through warfare is present. Even the exodus of General Kerensky.
Right.
Because this, not only does that mean that there's no one keeping these different powers from fighting each other, but also he takes most of the armament away.
He does.
So now everyone's poor of knowledge, poor of weapons, but still willing to fight. And there's some argument that may be why they use the most destructive means.
Yeah, it's almost like Kerensky in his idealized vision really did the curse on the inner sphere that he himself thought he was preventing. You know what I mean?
Yes. And he comes to play, well, his legacy comes to play an important part of the story much later in the history of the world, of this world. But at this point, the biggest impact he has is not being there.
100%. And then that lets the Succession Wars kick off. And the first and second Succession War are very detailed in terms of their lore in later editions. But at this stage, just, backdrops of extreme destruction, where the third Succession War is where our expectations of the Battletech or Battledroids character kind of really come into effect.
Yeah. And there's a sort of suggested grimness to it, but it's not explicit as far as any of the reading goes. It, as I said, it's more of a preface, so it kind of makes more of a backdrop and an excuse for having these things exist. There are some name drops. What was the one that we ended up finding?
One of the mercenary companies gets referenced. It is the Dragoons. Wolf's Dragoons gets mentioned.
Yes, which, I mean, it's a cool name. So, and that's a lot of what this part of these sections of the book feel like is I had some cool ideas and I have a general idea about what it should feel like and why people are fighting, but that's about the limit of it.
Right, exactly. And then there are some more details as to how the battle droids are organized at like a regimental scale and how a battle droid attack would work on a planet. So it does give you kind of a big picture of this is how a war between these robots would happen. And you can set your conflict within this greater scope based on what you're presented with.
It is the seed that plants this wonderful oak tree that we call Battletech, and all of its weird and wonderful and sometimes less good spin-off materials. I'm not a huge fan of the Ill Clan era.
Right. Yeah, the Ill Clan era is divisive. I mean, there's cool stuff in it, but if you're not a Clan Wolf guy, there's not a lot of stuff there for you other than Clan Wolf running victory laps.
Yeah, there's some interesting developments that happen in the story, but they feel like treading over old ground a lot of the time, where it's like, oh, we have to have another like clan war.
Yeah.
And come up with some kind of half-baked excuse for why that is.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, we better fight for Terra again.
But the gameplay is as good as it ever did. So I would recommend it. I don't know if I'd recommend this beyond a historical anecdote, but it does exist if you want to dig it up and try it and see how similarly it plays to.
Absolutely. And in terms of what it's going to offer you, as my summary is, it's a way to have a lot of fun with an armored combat game that isn't going to be bogged down in like millimeters of penetration value. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is still a big battle armor game, but it's fun. It's kind of silly. It's meant to be taken with a smile, So I think it does what it says on the tin. I'm a big fan of Battletech with all the cool models you can get these days. And, there's a lot to say about the whole setting in general, but I think this is a great starting point. And like Max said, if you want to play Battledroids, you still can play classic Battletech, which is effectively the same thing.
Yeah, and probably a little easier to play in most regards. So yeah, that'll bring us to the end of the episode. And tune in for the next one as we will be exploring Stormbringer, the Chaosium adaptation of Michael Moorcock's Elric series as a role-playing game.
Very excited for that. Very excited.
So hopefully you had fun listening and you'll join us again when we get into that.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.